About time you arrived. Where were you?
We were thinking of starting without you.
I was working on my story.
You had to create a story. How weak.
I played a part in my story, unlike you guys being witness.
Oh, I played a part too. I was very close to the events in my story.
I should really be telling your story, since I was actively involved in some events.
Yeah, well, I already called it, so you just have to do another story.
You never play fair, Jasper Stone.
Well, better luck next year, Victor Hudson.
Alright, we're all here now. So let's begin telling our stories. I'm excited to hear them.
Indeed. Who shall tell their chilling story first?
Not you. Your stories are always predictable.
My story is not predictable.
Oh yeah? We'll see. You want to go first then?
If you're going to say my stories are predictable, then I'm just not going to go first.
Oh, real mature.
Well, someone has to go first.
I will.
Here we go.
You never have a good story.
How do you know? I can tell good stories.
Oh, like the one about that slaughterhouse burning down with all the cows bellowed in agony as they died.
This one's different.
Can't be that different given your element.
Oh, is that so? Well, Graves, you asked for it. My story takes place on a night, exactly like tonight, when the barrier is at its thinnest, where shelter from the creatures of the night is around the fire, your only protection. But it might also be where the horrors lie in wait. And when they come out to play, you'll have a front row seat to greet them, submitted for your approval. I call this story The engines on the island of Sodor look forward to Halloween. They enjoy the fireworks and the children dressing up as wizards and witches. They also love Edward's spooky stories.
So we all know the scrapyard at Kildane is run by those two diesels, Ari and Bert.
The engines chuckled. Normally, the mention of the two scrap diesels would make the engines nervous, but they were currently away being mended at the works. This meant the engines could celebrate Halloween in peace.
But I'm sure you didn't know that the Kildane scrapyard was once run by a steam engine when it first opened.
The engines were surprised, but encouraged Edward to continue, and this was the story he told. Long ago, when the Sodor Iron Works was formed, it had its own dedicated engine. This engine would prove to look like Donald and Douglas, but this engine was not a Caledonian. This engine was a Johnson 3F with a Fowler tender. The only reason some would think this was her round cab windows. In all honesty, this engine had gained her cab from a scrapped engine, and she had it refitted to herself. This engine had no official name, but many engines just referred to her as Stella. Stella was a hard worker, always shunting trucks filled with slag that floated to the top of the molten iron, or shunting trucks to a place in the smelting shed called the Edge. It was so named as it was elevated above the furnaces to allow the scrap to be simply dumped out at the ends of the trucks. This was done so trucks could be unloaded quickly from truck to the furnace and for the company to save money. Stella knew the dangers of being too close to the edge, as the men joked that anything that went in melted into a puddle. One Halloween, Stella was bringing in a trainload of scrap to be melted down into new rails. She was passing by some low-hanging chains, and one caught on her whistle, knocking it off. She was so busy, she didn't notice. As she brought her train to the edge to prepare for shunting, her driver found something else had happened.
Your brakes are jammed, Stella. You're not going anywhere,
he said.
Oh, bother!
Huffed Stella.
What about that shipment I need to shunt together?
I guess the engine will need to pick it up themselves,
said her driver.
Anyway, it's light and our shift is ended. We'll tell the foreman to have the workmen see about repairing your brakes.
Stella was cross, but she could do nothing about it. Her driver and fireman damped down her fire. They explained to the foreman.
The mechanic for the night shift is out sick. Stella will have to be repaired in the morning.
Soon the ironworks had gone quiet, save for the roar of the furnaces as skeleton crew of workers worked the night shift. Later that night, another engine came to collect his train of flatbeds filled with rails. The engine was big and green. It had come from the other railway. He grumbled dreadfully as he puffed into the steelworks.
Where is my train?
He roared.
Sorry, our designated engine has broken down. You'll need to collect your trucks on your own,
Said the night foreman. The engine snorted angrily and puffed away to shunt his train. Soon the brake van had got his long line of heavy rails, but before leaving, they needed a brake van. They looked around and saw a brake van at the end of the long train that went around a bend. No one could see what was at the other end of the train,
Come on, old boy. Let's couple up and we can be off.
said the engine's driver. The engine seethed indigently as he dragged his heavy train to the next line. He banged into the brake van hard. Unfortunately, the train the brake van was on was Stella's scrap train. Stella woke with a start as she was violently shunted forwards and toward the edge.
Stop! Stop! I'm back here!
But no one heard her. Stella tried to whistle a warning, but nothing came out. She realized her whistle was gone. Suddenly, her front wheels left the track and she was pushed over the edge. Just before she was about to plunge over, the train finally stopped. The weight of the heavy scrap trucks kept her stationary.
Help! Please! Help! Pull me back!
But the engine didn't hear her. He was too far away and lost in his thoughts. The brake van was uncoupled from the trucks and the train set off. Stella stared down into the hot, boiling furnace below her. She could feel herself swaying back and forth, her balance hanging in a precarious balance. Suddenly, she became aware of a growing pain just under her cab. The pin holding her tender to her was beginning to break.
Oh no! Oh no!
She whimpered. Then, with a sharp crack, the pin gave way, and Stella tumbled front over end into the furnace, screaming. The only thing the few workers did finally hear over the roar of the furnace was the massive explosion, as Stella's boiler exploded as the water inside flashed to steam. Molten metal was everywhere. Of Stella, the only trace left of her was her slightly melted tender that was now fused with the tracks of the cooling glob of molten metal.
And they say on Halloween, Stella's ghost returns to the smelters looking for her lost whistle.
Edward finished before giving two loud toots on his whistle.
Ooh, spooky.
The engines cried, all shivering a little. Just then, a familiar blue car pulled up. It was Sir Topham Hatt.
Good evening, engines. Getting the night started with some scary tales, I see.
He then turned to Thomas, Percy, and Duck.
I have a special job for you. You are to collect some scrap from the smelters yard tonight for slow goods to the mainland in the morning.
On Halloween?
Squeaked Percy.
Don't worry, Percy. You'll be back in time for the fireworks.
Sir Topham Hatt said before turning and leaving.
Percy isn't afraid of missing the fireworks. He's a scaredy engine.
Thomas chuckled.
I am not.
Snapped Percy.
Come on, you two. No arguing.
Duck said.
We have a job and we should do it the—
If you say Great Western Way again, Duck,
Gordon interrupted, grumbling,
then you could sleep on the Little Western tonight.
The three engines puffed away. At the smelters, all Percy could think about was Stella the ghost engine. Thomas knew Percy was scared, so he kept on teasing Percy.
Oh, hello, Percy. How are you? Oh, what's that up there? Is it a spook?
Thomas squeaked.
It's just a piece of twisted scrap,
said Percy.
Isn't it?
You can never be too sure. Careful the ghost engine doesn't get you.
Thomas said spookily as he puffed away.
There's no such thing as ghosts.
Snapped Percy. Duck looked over at the little green engine sympathetically.
No one is brave all the time.
But I am not a scary engine.
Later, most of the work was done, but there was still one more job to do. The manager spoke to the engines.
Well done, you three. Now I just need one engine to finish up for tomorrow.
Ari and Bert should be back to work then, and I don't want to hear them grumbling about extra work.
Duck looked at Percy and winked. He was going to pay Thomas back for his teasing.
Please, sir. I'm sure Thomas wouldn't mind.
He said.
Of course not.
Thomas boasted.
I'm not a scaredy engine. You'd know all about that, wouldn't you, Percy, eh?
And with that, Duck and Percy left with their trains of scrap, and the manager left for his office. Once Thomas was alone, every sound and shadow was spooky. He was beginning to feel very scared.
Well, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing.
He said nervously. Suddenly, there was a quiet hiss, like the hiss from a steam engine's cylinders.
Well, who's there?
Thomas whimpered. There was no reply. Thomas's crew then returned from the station office.
Come on, Thomas, let's get a start on shunting,
said his driver. Thomas glanced nervously around as he backed down to start shunting. As he puffed toward the back of the smelting shed, he thought he saw a rusty tender sitting in the shadows. Thomas wasn't sure, but the tender looked melted, or so he thought as the flickering sparks lit the shed up. As Thomas backed down into a disused part of the smelting shed to turn back around to begin shunting, he looked all around for ghosts. He was so busy doing this, he didn't watch where he was going. Chains hanging from the cranes felt like ghost fingers as they scratched against his cab.
Oh, hey! Something's got me! No, get off! Go away! Go on!
He came to a stop in the siding. As his fireman stepped down to set the points so the little blue tank engine could head back home, Thomas wheezed steam loudly. Suddenly, an old steam whistle sounded out.
The ghost whistle!
Cried Thomas. He was so scared, the moment his driver opened the regulator, Thomas raced away as fast as his wheels could carry him. His driver thought it was just the shift change whistle.
Whoa, Thomas, slow down, we still have shunting to do.
Thomas didn't care.
The ghost engine is after me!
He cried. At Wellsworth, Duck and Percy had dropped their scrap trucks off at the yards. They were waiting for Thomas to join them.
I'm sure Thomas is feeling spooked now. It was naughty of him to tease you that way, Percy.
Duck chuckled.
Oh, he was just playing,
said Percy. He had relaxed and now didn't feel as scared as he had before.
After all, I think he's just getting back at me for scaring him with that cart of lime. I do hope he's not too much later. I wouldn't want him to miss the fireworks.
Just then, Thomas wheezed by the two engines.
Clear the way! Clear the way! He's after me!
I don't think he'll be late,
chortled Duck. Duck and Percy joined the other engines at Knapford to enjoy the bonfire and fireworks. Percy looked around and noticed that Thomas was nowhere to be seen.
Where's Thomas? You'll miss all the fun.
Well, it would serve him right for all his teasing. Engines shouldn't act that way. It's not the Great West.
That's it.
Gordon grunted from nearby.
You can sleep on the Little Weston tonight, Duck.
As Duck and Gordon began to bicker, Percy puffed away to find Thomas. No one noticed Edward slink away either, back towards Kildane. Percy found Thomas all alone at the sheds.
Are you all right, Thomas?
He asked.
Yeah,
said Thomas shakily.
I'm sorry I teased you, Percy. Duck was right. Nobody's brave all the time.
Percy smiled.
At least we know when to say we're sorry sometimes,
he said.
Now come on, Thomas. We can see the fireworks just fine from here.
The two friends puffed out of the sheds and sat on the turntable, enjoying the fireworks. Meanwhile, Edward puffed into the smelter's shed. He had a feeling some shunting was needed. But as he puffed along, he saw all the tracks in line, ready for work the next morning. He puffed into the disused part of the sheds and stopped.
Seems we don't have to do any work after all,
said his driver.
Driver? Could you give me a moment?
Sure, old boy. Come on, Sid. Let's get some coffee while we're here.
Once Edward's crew had left, he looked around. Besides the fizzing sparks and the sounds of the smelter shed, everything was quiet.
I know you're here,
he said, quietly. For a while, nothing happened, until an engine quietly puffed up from around a pile of scrap.
Playing tricks again?
Edward asked. The engine gave a cheeky hiss of steam.
I'm surprised that you're still here. I would have thought you'd have moved on after the steelworks bought those 2 diesels.
The engine hissed again, this time with less approval.
I know you worked here, but you shouldn't linger. Your unfortunate and horrible accident was in the past, and the work can be handled now that there are engines working here all the time. You don't need to stay.
The engine hissed again.
Argue all you want, but this place can manage alone. Or is there another reason you are here?
The engine hissed again, more sheepishly. Edward looked back and saw the rusty tender sitting quiet and forgotten.
You know a tender really isn't a part of us, right? Even if we feel our couplings, tenders can be swapped out for completely new ones. They are an extension, but not fully a part of our being.
The engine growled a little.
You can deny it all you want, but given how forgotten this line is, I have a feeling you'll be waiting here a long time still before you're reunited with your tender. How much longer are you gonna wait? Until it turns to dust?
The engine gave a hiss that sounded unsure.
Well, you'll have all the time in the world then to figure that out. You were always a little stubborn.
The engine gave a hiss that sounded almost like an airy giggle. Then it began to puff away.
I hope you'll keep the cheeky jokes in the meantime. Not every engine is ready to understand how complicated life and death is.
Puffing faded away into the sounds of the smelters. Edward looked up into the dark shadows for a moment longer before his crew returned and he puffed back to the sheds. He wasn't sure if the spirit would behave, or if anything it could do would be noticed by Ari or Bert. But at the same time, he didn't need to know. He had a feeling sooner or later Stella would see sense and move on at last. She always did in the end.
You cad. You're stepping on my element.
You deserve it. You think you know my element? Well, how's that for a surprise when I can tell a Carson Graves story better than you, Graves?
It was scary, I guess.
I swear I heard that story before. You just spiced it up.
I did no such thing. I just told the story as it really happened. Any other version of the story is just a bad retelling. Or one made less scary for kiddies like Graves.
You don't even know how to tell a ghost story, Sparks. That story was a snoozer.
As if you could tell a good ghost story. Your last story was about a fake ghost.
Oh, you want a real ghost story? Fine. Death is strange. You can linger on in limbo. Or you can rest in peace or torment. But what if those same spirits are awakened by the living, intentionally? What happens to those souls disturbed from their rest in an attempt to undo death? And how does that happen? Submitted for your approval. I call this story. The sun was setting as James puffed down the main line with a line of trucks in tow. The trucks were filled with scrap, all bound for the ironworks at Kildane. A recent cleanup at Knapford Docks had turned up a lot of rusted track and machinery that hadn't been used for a long time. And James had been rostered to take it, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been hoping to be asked to take a late-night passenger service or, at the very least, have a rest.
I'm surprised you're grumbling, James. Besides, we're full of metal in your favorite color.
A truck called.
Shut up! Rusty red is no color for a splendid engine such as myself. Sparkling crimson red is better.
James snapped back.
Oh, you mean like your nose that one time with the bees?
Another truck laughed. James wheeshed and snorted onwards, eager to put this job behind him once and for all. James arrived at the scrapyard just as the sun disappeared over the horizon. The air grew colder as he puffed closer into the smelting shed.
Brr. I really don't like this.
Neither do I, old boy. But a job is a job,
said his driver. As James came to a stop near the main office, the foreman walked up.
Ah, thank you for bringing us in. Now, I hate to ask, but could you shunt your trucks into the siding over there?
What, me? Why me? I'm not a shunter.
James hissed.
Well, Ari and Bert are still being repaired. Some bad fuel this morning wrecked their engines. Thankfully, Thomas brought some later. After the repairs, they'll have the fuel to work with at least,
he said before heading back to his office. James grumbled dreadfully as he shunted the train into the sidings. The trucks tittered cheekily as he did so.
Hey, look, guys, it's a new shunter. Can't be. This shunter is a big fat tender, and you know what they say?
Tender engines don't shunt.
Be quiet.
James snorted as he bumped the trucks into the buffers.
Trucks giving you a hard time?
Said a voice. James looked over and saw a young man with a backpack standing near the line side. He had a camera in one hand, and his attention was focused on the small screen. James looked down at the lad incredulously. He was used to train spotters, but at this time of the evening, and in a scrapyard, he found it a bit odd, and he really wished he was pulling something more splendid than dirty trucks and dirty sidings.
Yes? Now, pray tell, what are you doing here? This is private railway property, you know.
Oh, I know.
He sat his camera down and pulled a high-visibility vest from his bag.
I have permission from the manager to record here as long as I don't do anything foolish. I'm here working on a project for a university. The Spirit of Steam,
he said. James looked at the young man curiously.
What kind of spirit do you mean? You're not talking about ghosts, are you?
I am,
said the young man.
There have been many ghost sightings in photographs over the years. Such things as ghost orbs or even shadow figures showing up on digital photographs or on CCTV video footage. Where most people go to graveyards or old houses to find ghosts, I felt I'd try my hand at finding the ghosts of engines and rolling stock here. If none show up, I'll work on something else.
James rolled his eyes. The very idea of ghosts was absurd. Sure, he had thought he had at times seen spirits, but those had been turned out to be real things like Percy covered in ice or something else.
Well, you better be careful. A scrapyard is nowhere to play around, even at night.
James's driver explained.
I know. That's why I asked the manager. He said as long as I don't climb on piles of scrap metal, keep my safety vest on, and follow the safety guidelines, I can film here while it's closed.
The young man then picked up his camera and snapped a picture of James and his crew.
One for the memories,
he said, chuckling. Then he wandered off into the mist.
Strange lad,
James said.
I think it's interesting. I hope he's not too disappointed if he finds nothing,
said the driver. Soon James was uncoupled, and he began to puff out of the siding. Suddenly there was a clang, and his wheels left the rails. They bounced along the sleepers for a moment before his driver put on the brakes.
Bust my buffers! What happened?
James asked. His driver got down and inspected.
Some scrap metal must have tumbled off that pile onto the rails. You hit it and off you went.
Oh, brilliant! Now what are we going to do?
The driver and fireman headed to the office to speak with the manager. They returned with bad news.
The breakdown gang won't be here till tomorrow, James. You'll have to wait here for the night, I'm afraid.
Oh, lovely!
James hissed.
I was looking forward to a rest in my nice warm shed!
And with that, James's crew left and went home. The smelters still hummed with activity behind him, the graveyard shift working into the night. Eventually, James felt his eyelids drop down, and the red engine fell asleep. sudden hiss suddenly roused James from his slumber. He opened his eyes and looked around. The fog had become thicker, so thick that he could hardly see anything. Even the shapes of the buildings and trucks were lost in the gloom. Suddenly another hiss echoed in the yards. Only this time, it was accompanied by the sound of groaning metal.
Hello? Is someone there?
James called out. No one replied. Only the sound of more hissing. And this time, puffing. Only the puffing sounded different each time. It sounded like 3 different engines, but each puff sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. James felt a wave of nerves roll along his boiler. He felt surrounded all around, and what was worse, he didn't know who was surrounding him. Then he felt the ground shudder. Something big was coming. It had to be another engine, but in the fog, James couldn't be sure. The chopping and rumbling and screeching came closer and closer. Then, out of the corner of his eye, James saw a shape move in the fog past him. In the dim yard lights, it just looked like a dark shadow. The chopping was louder than ever, and the metal screeching sound, the sound of rusty wheels turning, sounded almost alive, like cries and moans. The shape moved past him, and then suddenly vanished. James gulped and closed his eyes tightly.
It was just a dream. Just a dream. Just a dream.
He comforted himself. Soon sleep closed in again, and James drifted off to a dreamless sleep. James was soon derailed and taken to the works to be looked over. After the inspection, the red engine was asked to take a passenger train when he got back to Knapford. The run helped ease James's nerves, and he soon forgot about what he thought he had seen. A few days later, the young man came to see James and his crew at the sheds. He was there to show them the pictures he had taken.
Check this one out first,
he said as he passed them the photo he had taken of James and his crew. In the photo, they saw James and his crew with the smelters shed behind them. But next to James, with just a corner sticking out, was a faded-looking tender. It wasn't very clear, and it was a little transparent, like it had passed by the camera too quickly to be clearly captured.
Now what's that? It looks like an engine tender.
I was the only one there,
James said, rolling his eyes.
Your camera must be faulty or something.
And that's not all.
The young man continued. He had brought his camera to the crew. The display screen showed one of the sheds in the ironworks, one of the yard lights, and piles of twisted scrap. It was all barely visible through the thick fog, the young man quickly explained.
I was messing with some of the settings and forgot I'd switched it from picture mode to film mode. I tried to take a still picture, but it wouldn't click like it usually would. So I took out my second camera and went to photograph something else. I was only away for a few moments before, well, watch.
He hit play on the camera, and the film played. The picture shuddered as if the camera was sat down. The voice of the man bemoaning his apparent misfortune, followed by the sounds of footsteps scurrying away. Then another sound came, a kind of puffing noise, followed by screeching metal. The screeching sounded intensely pained. James felt a cold shiver run down his back, and his mind thought back to that night as memories resurfaced. Then a big engine puffed across the screen. It was covered in rust, and had holes in its boiler that showed the boiler tubes. It rolled with a soft puffing sound, which at times sounded like 3 different engines at once. As it puffed past, no fire could be seen in the smoke box. The only light seemed to come from the little red tail lamp on its tender. Slowly, the engine rolled away from the camera, into the darkness, its red tail lamp the only thing in sight. Then the light flickered off, like someone had just flipped a switch.
I later came back and turned the camera off, but you saw it, right?
The young man asked.
Yes, we did,
said the driver.
Are you sure you didn't alter this video?
James asked, his voice quivering.
What? Why do you think I would do that?
You university kids are too clever. That engine might be nothing more than a broken old model toy being pushed through a model railway set done with fancy editing.
I'm serious.
The student insisted.
While I might be clever, I'm not this clever. Besides, didn't you see the engine? It didn't look anything like in any train spotter's book.
What do you mean?
James asked.
Does it look like Gordon, only with too many wheels?
Came a voice. The group turned to see Edward, looking over towards them. The old engine had been quietly building up steam while they had been talking.
Yes, it did. I had to play the video back on my TV to see it better, but I did see more than 3 driving wheels on this engine,
the student said. Edward looked down at his buffers and sighed.
Oh dear. Seems they are still around,
he said.
They? Who are they?
James asked, curious what Edward meant.
Well, they, for lack of a better word, are known as the Kildane experiment. A tragic tale that took place long ago, and one that no one at the smelters dare speak of.
The group looked on as the old engine continued.
The Kildane experiment began in 1966. Following the second act of the Beeching Acts, many engines were withdrawn from service and scrapped before their time. Young engines sent to old sidings to rust away and be cut up. It happened so quickly, scrapyards on the other railway became filled to capacity. It was because of this that some trains of scrap came to Sodor for processing. This was before our line became a heritage railway. That summer, a young but eccentric engineer from Croven's Gate came to the scrapyard looking for work. Following this young man's employment, strange things began happening. Workers would sometimes come to begin cutting up a scrap engine, only to find that someone had already started, as many parts were missing. Soon it wasn't just parts, as a whole scrap engine vanished once. For a time, no one could explain what was happening. It seemed as if the engine ceased to exist. Even receipts recording their arrival at the scrapyard would vanish. Police would occasionally patrol the scrapyard by night to keep watch for any break-ins, but none were reported. We were soon to find out what became of those parts. It was during one night when I'd just arrived with a delivery of petrol for the generators. We were just shunting them into their siding when suddenly there was a scream from one of the nearby sheds. The front doors flew open, and out came the young engineer, badly burnt. Before anyone could ask him what had happened, something big puffed out of the sheds in a cloud of steam. It was a monstrous-looking scrap engine. It had no face, just a rusty smokebox door. Its boiler and cab were from an A1, mounted crudely atop a 9F's chassis, pulling a rusty old tender behind it. Steam hissed and smoke billowed from its funnel and from its cab, which seemed to glow bright yellow. The hissing was pained, and at times it sounded like 3 engines puffing at once. The monstrous creation slowly puffed its way down the siding before coming to a stop on the points, when its corroded suspension springs finally snapped. When the paramedics and the police arrived, they asked the engineer what he'd been doing. He said he was trying to create a new engine that could revitalize steam on the mainland. He'd gotten a hold of the engine parts from the ironworks, using the place as a parts shop where he could scrounge up all the spare parts he could ever want. During his days off, he would sneak into the yard and steal more engine parts to complete his project. He managed to steal the complete scrap engine using a heavy hauler lorry owned by his brother, Frederick Packard, father to Jenny Packard, in fact. To hide his work, as he knew that all this scrap would be very valuable, he stole and altered receipts from the office to make it seem like no scrap engines had ever been delivered or engines arrived with fewer parts. He'd been in the process of test firing his creation when the water glass burst, spraying scalding steam and water all over him. His goals were terrible and foolish, and For his trouble, he would endure many painful surgeries that would end up costing him the use of one of his hands and a lifetime of horrible scars. I sat nearby so I could provide my testimony. During this time, the scrap engine made many terrible noises as it cooled down. Sometimes it was a murmur, other times it sounded like screams. The screams of 3 voices calling out for their end to come. The mess of engine parts was soon dragged away and cut up. But it seems that isn't the end,
Edward said, pausing. The men and James stared in shock at the story so far, and while they didn't know what to say, they had a feeling they could tell what would be coming next. Edward then continued.
Workers would say that they heard the sound of hissing and clanking around the yard during the night shift, like the sound of 3 engines puffing at once, but it wasn't just puffing sounds. Voices crying out for the end to return, that their rest had become disrupted. The voices would cry. It seems that engineer, and using whole parts of deceased engines, disrupted their rest, and now they roam the smelters yard seeking for their end to come. But it never will.
James and his crew looked at the student, who just stared at his camera. His face was still a stone, taking on an ashen appearance. He eventually looked up.
Well,
he said eventually.
I guess my video was a success.
James couldn't help but silently agree. Eventually the student left, and he puffed away to pull another train. He did so quicker than usual, almost as if he was eager to take his mind off of something. For weeks to come, the red mixed traffic engine shuddered at the sight of scrap trains. No one asked why, and no one would ever know why. No one but Edward.
Lame.
Oh, shut up. Mine was more original than yours was.
He's got you there, Sparks.
Yeah.
Oh, come on. A ghost engine made from the restless remains of 3 other engines. Please. Your story was so lame you needed 3 times the ghostly energy to rival mine.
At least mine wasn't just a retelling of an already existing story.
Enough, you two. Now that your story has been told, it's time we moved on to the next one. Who wants to go?
I'll go next.
Good. Some originality at long last.
Hey.
Hey, cool it. Jasper, you've got the floor.
Alright, well, my story takes place on the railway we're on, in fact. Oh, I know, there isn't much evidence to say this place was a railway, but it was. It was once a living railway, and my story takes place the day it died. Submitted for your approval, I call this story... A ring of the bell brought the attention to all on the surface. A clatter and the loud whirring of the electric winch roared into life, echoed across the yard. Trucks banged into each other as the green engine shunted them together. Kasni Howen provided lead, which the Mid-Sodo Railway used as their sole goods contract. There were whispers that things were becoming more unstable. The mines that had helped win the war were all closed now, as their mineral deposits dried up. Kasni Howen was the only mine that still had a source of mineral, and that was still going strong. While a lot of people still hoped the line would bounce back, this didn't seem the case, as now only 3 engines were working the rails. 2 men on break sat in the shade of the office buildings, eating their meager lunches. Soon discussion opened up between them about the railway and its engines.
I say, whatever happened to number 2?
One miner asked.
It went in the loo, of course.
The other said with a chuckle.
I mean the second engine of the railway, you twit. I've seen those 2 young ones and the grumpy old Duke, but never that other green engine. The one that looks like that other engine on the other railway in the middle of the island.
What? Didn't you hear? The new number 2 got turned to a generator a few weeks ago.
What? Never? So soon, too?
Yes, put him behind the shed. Turns out they needed it to power the workshop. They said that engine would be more useful than that yank-built piece of junk.
I can still hear yous, you know.
Stanley shouted. The men's gaze turned to face the pumping shed. Since the mine ran close to underground streams, and mines were always in danger of flooding during periods of heavy rain, it was important to pump the water out of the mine. The old steam engine that had powered it when the mine had opened had broken down years ago. In order to keep the mine operating and the goods traffic it provided the railway, the manager had sold their old generator engine to the mine. The engine itself glared angrily from behind the wall built in front of him. His former red paint had faded into a dull, greyish pink, thanks to the sun and rock dust.
Besides, it ain't my fault this stupid railway can't handle some spills, or can make the time to fix me up properly to be useful,
he continued angrily.
I remember one of your spills,
one miner said, chuckling his harsh smoker's laugh.
You dropped some rocks in the line, and Mig took have an axe in it, set a pasture through one of the windows, and they almost bled to death.
That was an accident. I told the crew they was overloading the trucks, but no one dares to listen to me, and I get the blame for it.
If you weren't such an horrid, awkward engine, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. If you were a more sensible engine, like Duke...
Duke. Everybody puts so much faith in that old geezer. I bet that engine causes plenty of accidents on a daily basis, but nobody dares give him a scolding. All because he was named by the Duke himself. He gets a free pass.
He would never! You know how he feels about his grace.
And that's another thing, that Duke. That guy was nothing but just a normal fella. Nothing extraordinary about him. Just cause Duke is named after some old guy who ain't even done anything to prove himself that he's worthy of having a grand title, he gets all the polishes and repairs he could ask for. The world bends over to make sure that old groaner stays in one piece. What did I get? Nuts. All I get told is stop riding so roughly and stop swaying side to side. Nobody even cares when I say my wheels are off center, or how these stupid rails are too shallow and they need fixing. Instead, I get yelled at and told I'm the incompetent one.
Rubbish! Any proper engine would know how to be careful.
No proper engine could work on this line even if they tried.
And what about Stewart and Falcon? They work just fine.
Same goes for Falco and Stewart. They all get the attention, so they ride easily on this line. Just cause they are young and impressionable little brats, they get coddled.
Ugh, no wonder they put number 2 behind the shed. With an attitude like yours, I couldn't tell either of you apart.
Stanley's face went bright red.
Smudger was his name, not number 2. Me and Smudger, we want to be useful. We want to work hard and make this place a proper railway. And what do we get in return? We get squat for a repair, get nothing but abuse, and get turned into useless junk. How can we be really useful engines if we're not on our rails?
The miners, having endured all the arguing they were willing to put up with, looked at each other, and one smirked. He turned to Stanley and said,
Because without wheels, you can't do anything but be useful. Too bad they didn't brick your ugly mug up too when they put you there. You talk too much anyways. Hardly useful.
The two men chuckled as Stanley stared dumbfounded at them. His face stuck as one of shock, then sadness, then anger.
You really thinks that without wheels I can't do nothing but be useful? Well, I'll teach you. I'll teach all of you. I might have lost my wheels and rails, but I can still do a lot.
Stanley yelled. The miners just laughed as they stood up and walked away, back to the elevator and work. Stanley seethed in fury, steam hissing from his fittings.
This railway wants to treat us engines like we're nothing but spare parts. all I wanted after the war was to be really useful for a good cause that wasn't for God or country, and this is the thanks I get? Well then, I'll show them what happens when this really useful engine decides he's had enough. Either I get my wheels back or this line goes down the tubes. Frankly, I'm not opposed to either option,
he muttered darkly. A year passed, and then in the cold, dreary month of December, the winter storms hit the island. It was cold, but never cold enough for the rain to turn to snow. Despite the miserable weather, work carried on. Men went up and down the lift, dragging lead out and loading it into trucks. From the pumping shed, hissing and clanking could be heard as the men forced the engine to pump the icy water out from deep in the mines. A torrent of angry curses from within, coming down as heavily as the rain, followed day in and day out. Until one day, the swearing stopped. So did the flow of water from the drainage pipe. The pumping engine broke down suddenly. Without a pump to remove the water, tunnels quickly became flooded in cold, murky water. Men drowned trying to swim to safety, or became lost when the tunnels flooded and collapsed. All that time, Stanley just smirked, as the men tried everything to fix him, to make him work. The men yelled at him, berated him, accused him of doing this all on purpose, cursed at him in all of the local languages. And all that Stanley said in return was,
"Listen, bud, I don't care a dime for a few drowned rats."
Eventually, the rain stopped, but the grim work continued for the next few days of trying to rescue the trapped men and recover the bodies. Soon the mine was forced to close down, as worries about the safety of the mine came into question. The owner did so in the hopes that recovering the dead wouldn't cost more lives in the process. This work would continue only after an inspection was performed the following day. Everyone headed home, leaving Stanley alone. Not that he minded, he was still feeling so very proud of himself.
"This'll show them,"
he said to himself. Night soon fell, and the moon shone down overhead. The temperature dropped, and mist began to form. It wasn't a very thick mist, but it did make the quiet mind feel a little eerie. Stanley was sleeping when a low noise woke him up.
"Eh? Who's there?"
No one replied. Before Stanley could close his eyes again, he felt the ground shake. He knew the feeling of rock being blasted, but this was different. It felt drawn out and not as powerful. He wondered what it could be. As he was pondering this, a low noise drew his attention up again. It was like the sound of a heavy train rolling along in the distance, but not entirely, as there was no sound of wheels on rails or chattering trucks. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Stanley closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. But then the sound returned. This time it came in different pitches. The deepness of the sound changed often and never stayed the same. It sounded alive.
"It's nothing. It's nothing,"
Stanley muttered to himself. But even as he tried to convince himself of this, the sounds continued on and on, getting louder and louder. It never seemed to stay still, but it moved around. At times it would be right under him, and then it would be across the yard near the offices. Stanley looked up to see the water tower behind the shower suddenly tilt to the side, freezing at an angle.
"What the hell is..."
Stanley's eyes darted towards the shaft elevator. The lone lamp that hung near the gate swung wildly, flickered, and then cut out. But even without the light, Stanley saw what was happening as the shaft elevator frame shook in the moonlight before violently lurching to the side and sinking downwards into the ground. His eyes widened as the rumbling grew louder and moved around. While he'd never experienced a cave-in at the mine, all this sound and movement and that low sound that changed and sounded less like the earth heaving, but the sound of men talking, screaming, bellowing. There was no way this was a simple cave-in.
They're coming for me."
Windows shattered in the office building as one of the stone walls bulged outward and fell down into the mist, not forming a pile of rubble as it should have. A set of buffers in the yard suddenly vanished from sight, sinking into the mist like it was a fishing bob being yanked under. Some trucks on the siding creaked and groaned as they began to slowly roll in the direction that the buffers had been. Then they suddenly dropped out of sight, smashing sounds hinting at their fate. Stanley felt his shed vibrating harder now. Grout fell from between the stones, tiles rattled and smashed onto the ground. His tall, rusty funnel shook. He could feel the vibrations through the pump he was attached to, something hitting the metal pipe that went deep into the earth. Before the engine could say anything, he was struck by a sudden sensation of movement, for the first time in years. Only wasn't anything like he'd ever felt before. It was a sudden downward movement, a falling sensation. The shed vibrated, crunched as its stone wall suddenly collapsed inwards on itself, the roof falling down and crushing the workable and gutted water pump the men had been trying to fix flat. To Stanley, the ground seemed to rise upwards around him. Only he knew too well the ground wasn't rising, he was sinking. In no time at all, the only thing he could do was look upwards as inky blackness surrounded him. He opened his mouth to scream, but dirt and rocks piled up around his mouth, smothering it. The moon shone brightly overhead, the edge of the hole he was in rapidly shrinking until the bright white orb in the sky was snuffed out. All Stanley could sense now was the steady downward sensation, and the muffled stillness of the earth that enveloped him all around and grew heavier and heavier. The next morning, men returned to the scene of devastation. Huge holes had suddenly appeared in the ground where once no holes had existed. The rails were bent and broken, some hung freely, spanning massive gaps. Parts of buildings were gone. The shower house half hung over a massive pit, where the remains of the water tower lay at the bottom. The elevator was half the height it should have been, and was tilted at the most unnatural angle. But miners felt something was missing. Upon turning their eyes towards one of the larger pits in the ground, where once the pumping shed had been, there was only a massive hole, with a few broken roof slates sitting in the middle. Upon seeing the devastation, the owners immediately closed the mine forever, deemed unsafe. The workers were paid their last paycheck, while the families of the dead were paid their full amount for an entire year of work. Casni Howen lead mines quickly ceased to be, and come the new year, the Midsoder closed its doors for good. Without a mine to serve, the engines were sold, rolling stock scrapped, and the rails torn up. You wouldn't have even known a railway had once been there. For years after, talk of the disaster would be whispered in taverns all over the valley. Of the poor men who'd lost their lives, of the men who'd lost their jobs, and rumours of the old mine being haunted. Stories that, on a clear night right after the days of rain and the mist rising around the old mine, a sound can be heard. A sound that comes from below the ground, from one of the many sinkholes where a building once stood. A sound of muffled cries, wailing in the darkness. As to whether these stories are true or false, no one can say.
Okay, that was an alright story.
It was miles better than your story, Sparks.
If you two don't relax and can it on the insults, you'll be banished from the circle. Good. Anyways, that was a good story, Stone.
Well, since you thought his story was good, why don't you tell the next one, Shepherd?
Sure, I'll do it. Well, my story takes place not only a long time ago, but on another land. Once a safe haven, this place turned into a hunting ground. To be caught is a death sentence. When caught, a long, drawn-out death by slow dismemberment awaits. But what's worse? To be on death's door, or is it to be a The cold wind blew, and the sky was already beginning to glow with the approach of the dawn. Down the quiet rails, a single steam engine hissed along at a breakneck pace. The engine was in British Rail green and pulled a single coach with a brake van screeching along behind. Oliver huffed and puffed loudly as he rushed along. He'd been stuck waiting in an old siding for a late-night goods to pass. The goods had been hours late, and he'd not wanted to risk being seen by diesels. He'd been stuck on a disused branch for weeks, listening to the diesels growl as they looked for a runaway steam engine. Now was the time to make a run for Sodor. But with the sun rising, Oliver knew he wasn't going to make it to his next hiding spot before the dawn. That meant he might be caught, and his run for freedom would be for nothing.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Tittered Isabel, his coach.
Driver, we're not gonna make it,
Oliver said.
Indeed. We might need to find a different hiding spot. And fast.
Just as the sun began to shed its golden rays on the tops of church steeples, Oliver hissed into a disused shunting yard. Weeds had taken over the tracks, and the station sat closed, with boards on its windows and graffiti on its walls. It felt very eerie, but with the sun almost up, it would have to do. The driver and fireman changed the points, and Oliver, with Isabel and Toad, slipped into the yard. They hid in the furthest siding from the main line. Trees and bushes had grown thickly here, and a derelict engine shed gave further cover. The fireman dropped Oliver's fire quickly. Just as well we stopped. We're almost out of coal.
Do you think it'll be enough to get us to Sodor?
Oliver asked worriedly. I don't know, said the fireman gravely. We'll need to source some more. We've gotten so far already, we can't fail now. The engine crew quickly placed rubbish on and around Oliver, to better keep him hidden while they went out to find extra coal.
We'll be back soon, old boy. Hopefully someone will have some coal to spare.
Then they left. Isabel and Toad fell asleep after a while. Oliver, however, couldn't sleep so easily. Soon, the sound of diesels running past on the main line could be heard, growling as they rumbled past. He kept a careful watch, listening for a sound that would mean they'd been spotted. But it didn't take long before Oliver drifted off to sleep as well. The sound of a robin twittering in a nearby tree could be heard between the growling purrs of diesels.
This place looks good.
Oliver woke with a start. The voice was not his crew or even Toad's. It was accompanied by a deep rumbling of a diesel engine. 2 of them. Oliver peered through the rubbish that was piled on his front, looking out. There were 2 diesels. One was a small shunter, and the other was a larger mainline diesel. Between them was a long scrap train, sitting in the yards off the main line. They were only 2 tracks away. Oliver bit on his tongue, trying to remain as silent as he could. The shunter spoke up.
You couldn't have picked a cleaner yard. Sitting here, this scrap will fall apart before we can get it to the scrap yard. It's off the main line, and you know how our controller will have a fit if we block the main line. Heck, he might toss us on the scrap pile if we do that.
The other diesel grumbled.
Yeah, so why are we leaving our haul of scrap here again? 'Cause the scrapyard you want to go to has cheated us out of hundreds of pounds many times before. I am sure another place will give us more for this junk. If you insist. Then we'll take some of this junk and see what other places will pay, and we'll go to the place that will pay the most.
The big diesel rumbled back and looked at the scrap train.
We should fill these trucks up a bit more to look like we have more to bring in. These trucks are hardly loaded. Well, lucky you. My driver brought a cutting torch. We'll just cut some extra of this kettle and add it to the trucks.
Oliver gasped silently as he heard the hiss of a cutting torch, followed by the sudden loud screaming of the engine being cut up. He couldn't see this engine, as the big diesel obscured his sight, only being able to see the sparks hitting the ground. He closed his eyes and tried hard to ignore it, But it was not possible. The screams carried on for what felt like forever. Eventually, the sound of diesels departing could be heard, a few trucks rattling behind them. The screams stopped and slowed into a series of pained moans. Oliver felt a small comfort that Isabel and Toad seemed to still be sleeping, somehow able to have slept through the screams. He supposed where they were, such noises were more muffled and less audible to wake them.
Hey, you.
A voice called. Oliver opened his eyes. The voice was not of his crew. The only other owner of the voice had to be the scrap engine. Nervously, Oliver turned and looked over at the engine. It was a rust-covered Ivet. Its tender was missing, and the amount of rust almost obscured its once bright black livery. The engine looked over at Oliver and sighed.
You poor thing.
He said slowly.
I truly feel sorrow for you.
Oliver looked puzzled.
Sorrow? How could you feel sorrow for me? You're on a scrap train with... those horrible diesels. And they cut parts of you off.
I've made my peace. That is the end, dear engine. I feel sorry that you are where you are now, stuck in hiding on a railway that has thrown us all away.
Oliver felt nervousness creep into his boiler. He began to worry this engine would call attention to him. But he needn't worry, as the engine then added hastily.
Don't worry, I won't tell them about you. You are very well hidden, and those engines only care about the scrap on this train. They won't dare look on your way. Besides, don't know how much longer I have myself.
What do you mean?
The old engine wearily looked back up at Oliver. He didn't say anything for a moment. Oliver felt he could tell what he was about to say just by the look in his eyes.
I spent so many years resting away. It's taken a toll on me. Soon, there won't be enough of me to wake up. It'll be the end. Forever.
A chill ran through Oliver's frames. He remembered the stories of what old engines felt just before they passed away. Those that were lucky enough to be spared being alive when the cutting began. How gradually engines would first feel pain in their bodies as the rust set in. Then gradually, that pain became less and less. Physical sensations would fade shortly after. An engine would become tired and want nothing more to do than just close their eyes and rest. And then, in a blink, they'd be gone, leaving a smokebox door in its place. The old engine coughed and brought Oliver's attention back.
What's your name, youngster?
Oliver. And what's yours?
Howard.
The old engine said.
Oliver?
Isabel moaned.
We're trying to rest. Do you want to get us caught?
Howard blinked in surprise.
What? Who said that? I thought we were alone.
No,
Oliver said quickly.
I'm here with my coach Isabel and a brake van named Toad. We're escaping.
Howard sighed heavily.
Oh, dear. You are that engine the diesels talk so much about. Rumors one of us is fleeing scrap. I don't wish to spoil your hopes, Oliver, but there is nowhere to go. The northern region, the south and the east, and your home of western regions have thrown us to the side. Why do you flee?
Because there's a place where steam engines are safe. The northwestern region, Sodor.
We're going there, Mr. Howard,
Toad said from the back.
We hear that railway's looking forward to keeping steam engines in service.
Howard looked away, his face still gloomy.
Sweet thought, but it's not possible. All the controllers have gone in and unanimously said that diesels are the way forward, and that's such a long trip, especially for a tank engine such as yourself. Doubt you're in very good condition for working life, Oliver, given the state of our railways.
Oliver felt indignity rising in his boiler. Sodor was his last hope, and while he knew his condition was a little worse for wear, he was certain he'd make it.
I might be rough, but Sodor is a haven for steam engines. Those engines pull actual trains, and they're taken care of no matter how rough of a state they're in.
But the diesels...
We read in a newspaper that Sodor will never be like this.
Oliver snapped.
My driver and fireman read in the paper that the famous Flying Scotsman is visiting there, and the controller made a statement saying his railway will never become like the mainland England. That is why we're going there. It's hope. Something you've got none to give.
The old engine looked at the enraged tank engine and sighed again, looking down at his buffers.
You are partially right. I have no hope. But it's only for myself and my state. That controller on that island doesn't indeed sound like a wonderful person. To invite Scotsman, a preserved steam engine, he must value preservation.
He then paused and looked over to Oliver.
I must have a little hope that some of us steam engines will survive, so long as there are people who see value in us. I do hope you are correct, Oliver. And that if you do make it, then you would cherish that opportunity. You'll be another very lucky few who defy the world and make it.
Oliver suddenly felt sorry that he'd lost his temper. This poor engine, who'd been cut up while he was still alive, still held out hope that he'd survive, even if he had no more hope for himself.
Anyways, it's late now, and you are to make it. You'll need plenty of rest for it.
Alright, I'm sorry I snapped Howard. Just, none of the engines on my old line felt I'd make it.
The old engine sighed and coughed a moment, his lips pulling back in a small, faint smile.
It's alright. Just keep that energy when you really need it. Show any doubters why you are a survivor, but never forget to take your time and enjoy the time you have, like I'm going to.
And with that, the engine yawned and closed his eyes. Oliver stayed awake a moment longer, listening to the engine snore. Soon the sound put him to sleep, with Isabel and Toad following suit not long after. Oliver was woken by the sound of diesel engines. They had come back. He turned to look at Howard and gasped. Instead of a face, all that greeted Oliver was an empty smoke box. Oliver felt terrible. Even without a fire, he felt colder than he'd ever been before. To have spoken to an engine one day, and then see them just gone the next, he didn't know it was possible to feel this terrible.
Glad we took that scrap to some other yards. We would have lost a good 130 pounds going to the one you suggested.
The big diesel chuckled.
Blow it out of your exhaust. Let's just hurry up and get the slug there before they change their mind.
The shunter stopped at the rusty engine's remains.
Look at this. He's gone. Surprised he lasted as long as he did, that useless kettle.
At least he won't complain anymore.
Not any more than his useless old body does already.
The diesels cackled with laughter as they backed up to the train and coupled up. Oliver watched as they took Howard's rusty body away, laughing all the time. This had once been a living engine, and to hear them laugh at his demise like it was nothing, it made Oliver sick. Later, when Isabel and Toad had awoken, they asked if the diesels had come back. Oliver took a deep breath.
They've already come and gone.
He said,
I didn't hear them come back.
Oh my.
Isabel whimpered.
Poor Howard. To be left with those brutes. He must be terrified.
Oliver sighed and stared out at the empty yard before him.
How terrified he must be, indeed.
As soon as night fell, Oliver's crew had returned. They hadn't found much coal, but they had found some. They quickly built up Oliver's fire and gave him plenty of steam. Slowly, Oliver clanked along through the bushes and weeds. His wheels squeaked as he rolled over the tracks the scrap train had been on. He saw pieces of melted metal lying amongst the weeds, their edges blackened by the cutter's torch and caked in brown rust. For a moment, he thought he saw an engine's lamp, its lens shattered. He gulped as he headed onto the main line, his fire flaring into life with determination.
Steady, boy. We need to go carefully.
His driver said, checking him.
I'll get to Sodor or bust.
Oliver said to himself.
I need to. For Howard.
Oliver rumbled over the points and off into the distance. Oliver now lives on Sodor. He made it to Barrow and Furnace before his coal gave out. Luckily, he was found and completed the final leg of the trip to Sodor thanks to Douglas. Now he, Isabel, and Toad work on the Little Western branch line with Duck and 3 more auto coaches. Since arriving, he's had many adventures and made many happy memories. When visitors ask about his past, only the version of his escape written down by the Reverend Audrey is told. None of his retellings include those 2 nights in that sighting, or of what happened there. Oliver, however, has reconciled with these memories, and the full horror has become softened to where telling his story of escape has become easier to talk about. Though sometimes when he's asleep, his mind drifts to the shadows of the past he keeps buried away. His dreams are then filled with the crystal clear sounds of diesel engines, pained screams, and the hiss of a cutter's torch.
Gruesome.
Horrific!
How do you move on from that kind of experience?
One day at a time, and each day it gets easier.
Oh, a great story. Not scary, but dark. Perfect for tonight.
Indeed.
Now I wonder if my story is any good.
Well, how about you tell the next story?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know.
Oh, just tell it. It can't be the worst story ever told.
Yeah, that story was already told.
What was that, Graves?
Nothing, just stretching. Go ahead, Victor. Out with it.
Well, alright, if you say so. So, we all know about a certain shunting diesel that lives on this island. His stories of the sea are simply riveting. But, what if I told you that his scariest story never took place on the water, but on land? Submitted for your approval, I call this story... The summer season was in full swing on Sodor, and trains were getting longer and heavier. The sidings at Nafford and Tidmouth were becoming a tangled mess with trucks and coaches mixed together. The engines tried their best, but they couldn't shunt and pull their trains at the same time. Sir Topham Hatt put in a call to the other railway for some spare shunters to help. They arrived the next day. Thomas had just arrived at Nafford when he saw them.
Splatter! Dodge! What are you doing here?
Oh, hello, Blue Puffball.
Said Splatter.
Isn't his name Thomas?
Said Dodge.
I don't know, the boss always called him the Blue Puffball.
What are you doing here?
Thomas said with a groan.
Oh, we're here to work in the yards. I thought it was at the harbour. No, dummy, that's tomorrow's job. Today is the station. I don't think so. I was sure tomorrow was the station.
The station master walked up.
Oi, get moving, you two. We've got a lot of trains to sort today.
The 2 shunters said nothing, but just giggled as they backed away. Thomas rolled his eyes.
Why did it have to be those 2?
Soon, Sir Topham Hatt was wondering just that. Wherever the shunters worked, the busy yards never got any neater. Coaches were blocked in sidings, goods were delayed, and the passengers were starting to complain. The 2 diesels seemed to spend more time either racing through the yards or chattering about anything other than their work. Their reckless habits and their constant talking soon spread to the trucks. They giggled and chattered noisily and were very troublesome with pushing or holding engines back. It was becoming so bad, even Salty was growing tired. He normally loved shunting trucks, but the noise and their behavior was wearing him out. One day, Bill and Ben came in with a load of empty trucks for a return trip down from Wellsworth.
I say, Ben, we don't talk as much as these trucks, do we? Not at all, Bill, so if the manager ever says we do nothing but talk, we'll know who to point the buffer at for being more annoying than us.
Salty chuckled as he rolled up.
Ahoy, twins! Back for more trucks. In I see they just be as troublesome as the first lots.
Indeed, Salty, and it's the fault of those two diesels. The trucks don't shut up and work is becoming a real drag.
You're telling me! Cranky called from above. I'm glad they aren't here, because if the trucks are this noisy already, those two might drive me to dive into the harbor.
Aye, they be a problem. Me sea shanty's work at calming the trucks down, but moment more of them come in, the trucks begin again.
Something needs to be done to make those two shut up. Indeed, Bill, but how do you shut up two chatterboxes?
The red diesel shunter thought for a moment before he suddenly grinned at the twins.
I be thinking, the only way to make 'em batten down the hatches be give 'em a good scare. And I may have this perfect scary story to set those two trouble-making barnacles to rights.
Oh, what kind of story?
Bill asked excitedly.
That be a surprise for when you be off this island. I tell you both then.
But that won't be forever.
Sorry, but I can't be letting you spoil the story to them early. You'd be undoing any work me story would do. I just need to get myself over to the yard and tell them my tale.
You can take that train of tankers. Fresh bunker oil from the mainland. It's gotta go to Naffer to refuel ships there.
Ah, that'd be perfect. Thank you, Cranky.
Don't mention it. Ever. Seriously. Salty quickly coupled up to the tankers and rumbled out of the docks.
Now I'd best be making with the tide and setting sail to the poor yard that has them for shunters. Before more of those trucks return to the site of mischievousness. Keep an eye on the place, Cranky. I'll be back before dark.
As if I can do anything else but look down on this place, came the grumpy response. Back at the yards, the two shunters were still being careless. They were racing along the tracks, pushing trucks full of coal.
I'm winning. No, you ain't. Totally am, winning by a buffer. Oh, you keep saying that now, and watch as I win. Ah!
The two shunters ran into the buffers, sending the loads everywhere.
See, told you I'd win. No, I did. I hit the buffers first. That was yesterday, buffers for brains. Well, clearly we're at an impasse. Well, why is that? I don't know, but it sounds right. It sounds left to me. No, it's right. Nah, I'm sure it's left.
A loud horn blast made the two stop. Salty purred up with his train of tankers and stopped, glaring at them.
Avast! You keep turning around the yard like that, and something unfortunate might happen.
Like what? What do you know?
Oh, wouldn't you like to know? In fact, let me tell you all about it, and maybe you'll turn shipshape.
Salty growled.
Who cares? He's just gonna tell us another boring story of the ocean. Maybe you should learn the rest of the alphabet first. Yeah, so you always get lost at sea.
Salty stared at the twin diesels firmly. He wasn't taking what these two jabbering idiots had to say.
What if I be telling a story, not of the ocean, but on land?
The diesels paused in their shunting and their jaws hung open. This was something they thought they would never hear from the dockside diesel. Salty smirked. He had the troublesome duo hooked.
Before I came to Sodor, I was on loan from Southampton docks to a small shunting yard near Sheffield. The old owner, the heartless pirate he was thinking of selling me for scrap, but decided to send me there to help with the yard foreman out of place in the order. I was grateful for the temporary reprieve from being tossed to the breakers, but not for where I was sent. It wasn't just this place was far from the sea, but it was also because the yard shunters there were. A pair of useless sea serpents.
Salty looked around the yard. glaring at the mess he saw before him. Trucks and coaches were mixed together, and loaded cars stood at loading platforms, blocking the way for empties to be loaded. The two shunters darted past, bumping trucks into each other, chuckling as they did.
You need to live a little.
Spinner chuckled.
Get the salt air out of your radiator!
Tanner sneered.
You're not on the sea, and you don't even live here!
The two diesels, in their chipped British blue livery, were the most awkward diesels the dockside shunter had ever met. Ever since Salty had arrived, the diesels always had an opinion that would go against his own when it came to organizing the yard. And when they did work, they darted around the yard, taking curves and points hard, bumping trucks and damaging them. The trains were late, damaged, or so badly disorganized, the train needed to be reorganized or goods shifted to undamaged trucks.
Racing around the yard like that, you'd be mighty dangerous. You keep darting like the sharks you are, and you'll end up driftwood.
The two diesels laughed harshly and oiled away to find more trucks to smash. Salty got right to work, humming his sea shanties and putting the trucks into a trance so they didn't cause him any trouble or mischief as he put them into their proper places. The two Class 08 shunters didn't do anything to help. They had more important things on their minds, like bumping trucks into one another or racing across the points as fast as they could. This continued for the next 2 weeks. Salty tried to warn them, but they only laughed and called him names. It all came to a head one afternoon. Salty was pushing a long, heavy train of stone into a siding when suddenly Spinner called out to him.
Hey, sailor, watch this.
Salty barely had enough time to get out of the way of a large wagon loaded with heavy iron pipes rattled over the points where it had been moments ago and smashed into an empty pair of vans. The vans derailed and toppled over. Spinner rolled over, looking cross.
Now why did you not catch it? Look at the mess you've caused.
That be your own mess, matey. You be in the shunting yard, not a rugby court.
Before they could argue any further, the yard manager strolled up. Needless to say, he was cross.
This accident is going to cause a major delay. You engines better get this cleaned up sharpish.
While Tanner went to get the breakdown train, Spinner was left to pull the undamaged trucks away while Salty continued to assemble an outgoing goods train.
This is all your fault. All you had to do was catch the truck and this wouldn't have happened.
Salty, who normally held his tongue with such cheek, finally lost his patience.
I've heard enough rage water from you, Spinner. You want to go around smashing trucks and tearing around like a typhoon? Then you go get yourself away from this yard and take your shipmate Tanner with you. You two were made for each other, but don't come crying to me when you both get killed.
Spinner sniffed and said nothing. Salty was then uncoupled from the trucks and began to roll across the yard to pick up more. As he rolled towards the loading platform, he had to stop suddenly as Tanner came rushing into the yard, pushing the breakdown crane. The shunter just sneered at Salty as he went past. Salty ignored him and continued on his way to the loading platform. Before his buffers could even touch the trucks in front of them, a thunderous crash was heard from behind, followed by a scream of pain. Salty didn't waste a moment as he suddenly backed towards the scene of disaster. Tanner had been racing with the cranes and couldn't see that he was on the same line as Spinner and had run hard into the back of him. The crane's boom had been resting on a flat car originally, but had been smashed to splinters between the crane and Spinner, whose cab was pierced and squashed by the crane boom. Luckily, his driver had been outside the cab talking with a plate layer, avoiding being killed in the collision. Tanner was also damaged, as the sudden stop had severely damaged his buffer beam. The two diesels groaned in pain. The yard foreman was livid.
You blithering idiots! Look at this mess. I didn't think it was possible for two diesels to cause so much confusion, but it seems I was wrong. Now Salty will have to do all of the work on his own, while you two are mended,
he said, before adding ominously,
maybe we'll just kill two birds with one stone.
But he said this to himself more than to the diesels. Spinner and Tanner were gone for the next week. Salty's lease was renewed to keep the yard running, and he managed the work alone. During this time, a stout gentleman came to visit the yard. Salty would see him talking with the yard foreman, though he could never hear what they were talking about. Besides, he had his work to do. When the week was over, the yard foreman spoke to him.
You've been an absolute lifesaver, Salty. The yard has never run better. I'm actually sorry to see you go.
Aye, sir. I was trying to do my best. But where should I go now? You're not gonna send me back to me owner, are you?
No. As a matter of fact, you'll not be going back to your old owner. In fact, your old owner is no longer your owner. I've been speaking with someone from a small island off the coast of England. He came here looking for a useful diesel shunter, and when he saw you, he told me he had to have you on trial. He phoned to tell me that after your time here was done, that you were to travel to his railway to work. He says if you work well and help out with a big upcoming shipment, he'll make you a permanent member of his fleet.
Salty was excited because, as any wise sailor knows, islands are surrounded by the sea.
Oh, thank you, sir. But what about those two urchins, Spinner and Tanner? Won't this yard end up in the troubled state again, with those scoundrels around?
Never you mind about those two, Salty. They have been dealt with, and given their adjustments, they won't be causing such trouble again.
Salty wondered just what the foreman meant by that, but the man was quickly called away and he had to sort out another train. As dusk began to fall, Salty was still working. He was ready to couple up to some vans when the yard foreman waved him down.
That's enough for you, Salty. Spanner will take care of this lot from you. It's time you're off to your yard for a rest before your journey to Sodor.
Aye, sir. That'd be a fine idea. But who's this Spanner?
You'll see. You'll pass him on your way.
Salty, still confused, hissed down the line and headed for the yard exit. As he rolled along, the signal went red, bringing him to a stop. Salty waited in the growing gloom, waiting for the engine to arrive. It came with a sluggish grumble and a growl. It crawled along at such a slow pace. Salty wondered if he'd ever get a clear path. Soon a brake van came into view of the yard lights. Salty's engine purred louder in anticipation that soon the train would clear the points. But soon it stopped, without clearing the points. Salty saw something just behind the brake van, but it was too dark to make out. It looked like a pair of vans. Suddenly, the yard lights came on, revealing the vans to instead be two diesel shunters. As the shunter uncoupled the train, Salty stared in surprise. The faces on these diesels were ones he knew. It was Spinner and Tanner, but they looked miserable. Spinner's cab was completely gone, and in its place were bare metal plates. No controls could be seen. Wires snaked out his cab and connected to Tanner's front where wires had never been able to be before, and their couplings had been welded together, fused in an unbreakable chain. Salty instantly knew these two would never move independently of each other ever again. They were fused together forever.
Och, admiring the new Class 13, Salty?
A nearby worker asked.
Class 13, you say?
Salty said slowly.
Aye, all the power of two diesels for the price of one. Front engine's hooked up so it only needs one driver in the rear to make them both move at the same time. Should be extra strong and saves hiring two drivers. I must say, they look a wee bit familiar. Or maybe that's just my imagination.
Salty said nothing. He looked at the duo, seeing just how sad they were. He wanted to say something, but the signal dropped and it was time to go. So, without a word, Salty left the yard, and the diesel, now known as Spanner, behind. The two 08s were stunned as Salty concluded his story. Then the dockyard diesel turned his gaze back to them. His expression was hard and his voice firm.
So I be careful, mateys, or else maybe the fat controller or your owner will make you both useful in the same way as poor Spanner,
he said, before a guard's whistle blew from the back of his train and Salty rolled away, humming a grim-sounding sea shanty. Splatter and Dodge watched him leave. The two bumbly buffoons for once had nothing to say. Soon they cast their eyes to the tracks and got back to work. For the rest of the day, they did their work quietly. They did so without fuss and kept the inane chatter to a minimum. Weeks later, the busy season relaxed, and soon there was not enough work for the OA twins to do. They left the island quietly. They said nothing to another engine, not one snide remark. The steam engines just smirked when the diesels were not looking. The two idiotic diesels seemed to have been put right, and all the engines had Salty to thank.
You're right. That story wasn't any good.
Hey!
Oh, I thought it was creepy.
Sounded like it was left up to the last minute to me.
At least it was original, unlike your story, Sparks. You can't say anything bad about it.
I'm not saying it was bad, it just felt not polished.
Well, sorry. I had to hurry to get this story ready for tonight. Not like I was sitting on my story from last year like you.
Hey!
Silence. Don't make me banish you, Sparks. At least not before we hear the last story.
Right, it's my turn.
Come on, let's hear it. It's late and I'm feeling tired.
I'm still fired up. Let's hear this story. Besides, someone has to tell Graves the ending when he falls asleep.
Sparks?
Oh, forget it. Wolfgang, he's always gonna be like that. Besides, it's the last story and I'm the storyteller. Now we all know what the skyline of every major city during the Industrial Revolution looked like, with all its chimneys and smokestacks pumping smoke into the air. Some of those smokestacks moved around from place to place, the ones on steam engines. But times change, and what would a steam engine who has never seen such drastic change think if they were to revisit such a city? Seeing no more chimneys, no more smokestacks, and yet industry is still chugging along as if nothing had happened. Submit it for your approval. I call this story Thomas yawned as he felt the warmth spread through his boiler. He heard the quiet conversation of Percy talking with his driver, something to do with the post.
Are you sure there isn't anything for me?
Percy asked.
Afraid not. Just some letters from family living on the mainland and other junk mail.
His driver said.
What's got you interested in the post, Percy?
Thomas asked with a yawn.
I know you like that job, but I don't think anyone would be writing to you. You don't even have a post box for Tom Tipper to put any letters in,
he added cheekily. Percy rolled his eyes and scoffed.
I'm looking for letters from my friends on the other railway, Thomas. I worked in many little yards before Sir Topham Hatt bought me and I came to live on Sodor. Our drivers helped to keep us in touch by writing letters. I've gotten a few recently, but none from Ginty and Pug. You remember them, right? They came to help while we went to London to visit.
Thomas did remember them, and he could remember making a fool of himself in front of Ginty as he was showing off. Ginty had laughed at him, but they became friends by the time he and the other visiting engines returned back to their own railways.
I do, and that's strange indeed. You told me you were good friends with them, right?
Very good friends indeed. It's strange I've not gotten any letters from them. My driver has sent 2 letters asking if they are fine and to respond, but I've not heard anything since. I'm worried they might be withdrawn.
Pah!
Thomas scoffed.
As if that could ever happen. Shunters like Ginty and Pug are indispensable. Even if the other railway is pushing for more of those diesels like that one that came to the mainline sheds, we'll always have a place here.
I don't know, Thomas,
Percy said, unsure. Thomas huffed out of the sheds and went to pick up his coaches.
I'm sure they're fine. If I can, I'll go over and see what's keeping letters from them,
he hissed to himself, although he wasn't sure just how he would get the travel to the mainland. His chance came sooner than expected. Thomas was just puffing into Ellsbridge with his afternoon train when the yard foreman walked up.
There is an order for a shipment of stone to be brought down to Barrow and Furnish. Sir Topham Hatt says there are no spare engines other than you, Thomas. Think you can manage?
Thomas fizzed with excitement.
Certainly, I can do that.
Then the job is yours. Daisy will handle your passengers till you get back. It's a long way to get there, she'll be quick.
And then he walked away.
Now I'll see what's going on with Percy's friends and why they're not responding to his letters,
Thomas said to himself. The sun was getting low in the sky as Thomas rolled over the bridge onto the mainland. The little blue engine was bubbling with excitement. It had been years since he had last been there, and he was eager to see how much had changed. He chuffed past the station over to the goods yard. As he rounded the bend and crossed under the road, Thomas was struck by something. Some coal bunkers laid near the trackside, completely empty. A coal chute nearby was covered in rust, with an old sign hanging from one bolt, out of order. A nearby water column had a similar sign hanging from its release chain.
This is odd. How do you keep a shunting engine fueled without coal?
He thought. As Thomas came into the yard, he was struck by how silent it was. Trucks were all in the sidings, tidily arranged, and yet there was no engines to be seen. No clouds of steam and smoke in the air to give any hint that they were there. The air began to get cooler, and a mist was starting to form.
That's odd. How come I don't hear any whistles? A yard needs a pilot engine to look after it. Where are they?
A yard foreman walked up.
Just leave your train there. We'll get a shunter to move it later,
came the gruff response. Thomas looked around. He didn't see any other engines apart from himself. Before he could ask, he heard a growl and a roar from behind. Quickly, a big mainland diesel roared by, its dark blue and yellow paint standing out from the long train of dirty trucks. It roared through a warehouse loading platform and disappeared into the encroaching gloom.
But where's the shunter? I haven't seen or heard one since I arrived.
Who's over there?
Thomas looked over to see a faceless diesel rumble past, dragging a train of tankers. It seemed to growl louder as it passed by. As he looked around, he noticed signs. Diesel fuel, diesels park here, don't idle in sidings, and diesel oil were what they said.
Where's Genty? Or Pug? Don't they work here?
Thomas asked sheepishly.
Don't know no Genty or Pug. Haven't had a Genty in this yard for... I don't bloody know. Anyways, you're uncoupled, so why don't you get yourself out of my yard?
Thomas's crew, unnerved by the terse order, quickly opened the blue tank engine's regulator, and they raced away into the distance.
We have to find a turntable or something to turn around. If only this fog wasn't so thick.
He was right. The mist was turning into fog as the temperature dropped. Thomas rattled over the points quickly. His eyes darted around as shapes appeared out of the gloom. Everywhere he saw diesel notices, coal bunkers filled with weeds and marked with masking tape crosses, indicating not to be used. Taking a guess, he followed a set of track curves between some buildings, which gradually became more open as the warehouse got smaller in scale.
This must be the way,
he thought. But it wasn't. Thomas followed the track for a ways, but nothing felt right. The tracks creaked and groaned under his wheels as the weeds brushed his chassis. Now he was certain this was the wrong way and he was lost. But up ahead he saw a gloomy shape of some steam engines in the dim dusk light.
Driver, look! Steam engines,
Thomas said hopefully.
Maybe they can tell us.
The words died in his mouth as the mist slowly cleared to reveal just where Thomas was. There were steam engines, but they were all covered in rust. They lay in piles near the tracks. Many did not have wheels and were just boilers stacked up haphazardly. The few engines still on the tracks chilled Thomas the most. These engines were not as rusty as the others, and seemed to have most of their parts, but they were silent. Silent and dead. Darkened smokebox doors stared out at Thomas, where their faces had once been. All the engines were small tank engines, just like him. Just like. Thomas gasped as he looked in the back and saw a familiar pair of engines. One had 6 small wheels, and the other had 4. Rust almost covered their early BR crests.
I think we should head back.
The driver stammered. Thomas said nothing, but he quickly puffed away the moment his regulator opened. The scrap engines faded away from view, and soon they were lost in darkness and distance. Percy parked his post vans neatly in the sidings and then puffed towards the sheds. As he chuffed over, he noticed one berth's doors were closed up tight. He puffed into his berth and saw Thomas sitting silently.
Thomas?
The blue engine jumped in shock as if he hadn't noticed Percy coming up. He then tried to force a scowl onto his face.
Percy! Don't do that!
He berated, trying to sound cross, though Percy could tell something was on his mind.
Sorry, how did your trip go? I'm certain you enjoyed it since you never get to travel along the main line. I know you love your branch line, but still, it's nice to get out sometimes.
Thomas looked around, as if not sure what to say. Percy puffed in and parked by his side.
How was the mainland? I'm sure a lot has changed. What station did you drop your train off at?
Barrow and Furnace.
Oh, that's where Ginty and Pug worked. I heard they were moved there following our trip to London. Did you see them there?
Thomas looked away and grimaced. Percy looked at him carefully, and in a moment he understood.
Yes, I saw them,
Thomas said.
They really miss you and said they couldn't write to you 'cause they were so busy. I mean, you know the other railway, always busy and...
They were scrapped, weren't they?
Thomas paused mid-sentence and looked at Percy. The expression on the green saddle tank was blank and firm. It wasn't one of worrying or anything, just acceptance, as if this was something he'd long suspected.
I'm sorry, Percy. I really am,
said Thomas sadly.
It's not the first time, Thomas. I've gotten letters from friends who've been withdrawn and scrapped. I only wish Ginty and Pug have written a letter to me to say goodbye. Maybe they did, and the letter was lost in the post. I guess I won't know.
Thomas looked at Percy with a sense of wonder. He'd always known that Percy was a cheeky, bouncy, somewhat naive engine. And yet, he was handling the news very well. He could see sadness in his eyes, but also acceptance that Ginty and Pug were no longer around. He wondered for a moment how Percy could be alright with that. Then, as if sensing his question, Percy spoke again.
We are very fortunate to live here with such a kind controller like Sir Tom had, aren't we, Thomas?
Yes, Percy. We are.
It took a while for the engines to move on. Percy recovered in remarkable time. Soon he was cracking jokes with the trucks and being cheeky as always. Thomas took some time. Sometimes, when he was in the shunting yards, he'd stare out along the main line, retracing his way back to those cold sidings in his mind. Eventually, work shoved those thoughts out of his mind, and a smile soon crossed his face once more. But it would be a long time before Thomas would ever dare journey beyond Sodor.
Not a bad story.
Not bad. It was great. Who knew Percy was so... well, mature.
Gale did. It's always the one you'd least expect.
Like you.
Just you wait, Graves. I'll beat you next year.
Just try to come up with something original next time.
Well, anyways, thank you, Gale, for that wonderful story. A perfectly dark tale to cap off the evening. Same time next year, everyone?
And as always, happy Halloween all. See you next year.
Well, catch you all later. Hopefully next year I'll have a better story.
Hey, it was a good story. I'm sure you'll surprise us all next year.
We'll just have to wait and see. Night all.
I'll head off too. Night, everyone.
Jeez, everyone's got a good exit but me.
Hey, how would you portray death in a way that doesn't give anyone nightmares?
And yours isn't nightmare fuel.
Okay, I'm out of here. You two are as fun as a toothache sometimes.
Finally. I thought he'd never leave. I'd hate to be banished for a year and miss out on the stories.
You'd be doing us a favor if you did.
Well, that sounds like a problem for you, doesn't it? Anyways, till we meet again, Graves. Tally-ho!
Flashy git. Ashes to bones, bones to paste, you wither away, your resting place, eternity in a wooden case. We all fall down. I'll be seeing you again someday.